Hi, I'm Eric. It is Friday afternoon here in Thailand, July 25th. And I want to talk about this is a new video. I want to talk about a good friend of mine, dear friend of mine, who lives in Ukraine. And the reason why I'm motivated to do this is because there's so much confusion about what is going on in Ukraine, what the background of it is. People really don't know the full story of it, and there's different aspects of the story, of course. But I felt it would be important for me to give you the observations of somebody who actually lives there. This is a Russian-speaking person. She told me that she can't speak fluent Ukraine, but her native language is Russian. She came from an area of Ukraine, which has been considered historically part of Russia, and so what I've done is I've had her record a few videos, not videos but audios, of her experience growing up in the Soviet Union, her life. She ended up moving to Canada for a while. She came back to Ukraine, and now she's talking about the difference between what Ukraine was like when she was growing up as a child in the Soviet Union and where it is right now. So just a little bit of background is that the word Ukraine etymologically, that is the derivation of its meaning, means borderland. So during the period of the Russian, as the Russian Empire developed around Moscow, historically it actually had begun in the city of Kiev. It was called the Kievan Rus meaning the Russians, and this goes back like 1,000 years. But gradually the center of power, I guess you could say, shifted towards Moscow. But nevertheless, Kiev was certainly an integral part of Russia. I've often mentioned that my grandmother, all four of my grandparents came from either Lithuania or Belarus or possibly Ukraine, but basically that area of the western edge of the Russian Empire before it became the Soviet Union. They had left before it became the Soviet Union. But in any case, my grandmother used to say, "You can ask your way to Kiev," and I've asked my Russian friends about that phrase, and they say, "Yeah, that's a very common phrase. It's kind of like all roads lead to Rome." So Kiev was definitely part of the Russian space, the Russian cultural space. What happened, and I'm just going to give a very, very brief my understanding of Ukrainian history, is that you had this area called Ukraine, but then there were other areas that were to the south, to the west of that, which gradually became part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So you had areas of western Ukraine, which now has the city of Lvov, or the Ukrainian pronunciation of it is Lviv, and there's other areas that the language is related to Russian. It's a Slavic language, but it has connections to Polish and other dialects. So Ukraine is a different language. If you speak Russian, you probably won't understand Ukrainian, but it is related. It's kind of like if you're English or you're American, you won't understand somebody speaking French, but they are related languages, or even German. Okay, so that said, when the Russian Revolution took place in 1917, there was chaos throughout that whole area of the former Russian Empire, and a civil war broke out, and many of the people who opposed the revolution, they became what are called the White Russians, but there's also this areas of Ukraine who had this nationalistic idea that they wanted to have their own country, and there were various leaders of that. A couple of them, one was named Petluri, another one was named Lebed, another one was named Bandera. Bandera became probably the most famous of the you can say extreme Ukrainian nationalists. And my friend refers to Banderites in her discussions. So in any case, the Civil War ended, and Ukraine became a constituent republic of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So there were 5 areas that had all been part of the Russian Empire space, but they became what were called separate republics, Soviet republics. So they had some degree of autonomy, but they were part of this kind of, you could say it's roughly analogous to U.S. states, where, there's a state of Massachusetts and a state of Mississippi, and they all have kind of different laws, but they're all part of the United States. There was something similar to that in the Soviet Union. Okay, so right after that, right after the revolution, the Western powers were both angry and terrified, because this was a worker revolution. So basically, what you had here was a coalition of industrial workers in some of the major cities, especially Petrograd, or what became Leningrad and is now called St. Petersburg. And you had Moscow, and you had other cities, and they were the industrial workers. And of course, Marx talked about how capitalism would evolve into socialism, where the workers would be the ones who made the decisions instead of people who have a lot of money. But they needed to get the rural peasantry on board with this, and eventually they did succeed in saying, "Hey, look, you guys, you were granted freedom from serfdom, in the mid-19th century, but you still don't really have control over your lives. And so what we need to do is unite workers and peasants and overthrow the current regime of the Tsar." And what happened after the Tsar was forced to abdicate in February of 1917, but he was replaced by Social Democrats, headed by this guy named Kerensky, not Zelensky, but Kerensky, and he was a Social Democrat, but he had this idea that they needed to keep this war, the First World War, going. And Lenin, who was the head of the Bolsheviks, the Bolshevik meaning the majority faction within this revolutionary movement, he said, no, what we really need to do, we need peace. And he promised the new peoples of the Soviet Union peace, land, and bread. And even though the Russians had suffered significant reverses during World War I, fighting against the Germans, when it came down to fighting for finally having their own country, they defeated not just the white Russians, that is, the Russians that were part of the nobility who wanted to maintain the Tsarist regime, or even the Social Democrats. There were a number of other countries, the United States, England, France, Czechoslovakia. So I think there were like 8 countries that actually invaded the new Soviet Union, and nevertheless, the people of the Soviet Union fought them all off single-handedly. But that wasn't enough, because they blockaded this new country, because they thought, okay, if we can't defeat them on the battlefield, we'll starve them out. And so there was famine, there was tremendous dislocation in the agricultural sector. So that was a huge disaster for the new Soviet Republic. But eventually they overcame that, and they enlisted allies. They enlisted people who were willing to work for them. They hired Americans, in fact, to help them build up an industrial economy. They made a commitment to electrify the country. And so by 1920, the country was, the Soviet Union was getting back on its feet. There were still famines that took place in the early 1930s, and that affected Ukraine. And the Ukrainian nationalists have claimed that was a deliberate attack on the Ukrainian nation, so to speak. whereas the fact is that there was suffering all over the Soviet Union due to this lack of crops. But once they really got their industrial agriculture set up, where they had collective farms, and they dramatically increased the productivity of their farms, that allowed many people to. They basically automated the farm work by making thousands of tractors instead of horse-drawn plows. They were able to free up workers to build up an industrial economy. And so by 1941, the Soviet economy had developed vastly. It had actually completely outperformed the capitalist economies of the West that were going through depression during the 1930s. So you had a tremendous increase in the wealth of these Soviet republics, and Ukraine was one of those Soviet republics. And as my friend points out, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic ended up becoming the richest of the republics, for two reasons, as she describes in her audios. One was the fact that the western side of the country, the western part of the country, was more agricultural, and they had tremendous crop, lots of, tons and tons of crops that they were using to feed the Soviet Union as well as other parts of the world. But you also had the areas in the eastern Ukraine, namely in the Donbass area around Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkov and these other cities that were great industrial centers. So one of the biggest industries that has continued even to this time is that there's a very high grade of coal in the Donetsk area. It's anthracite coal, which burns very hot, which is what you need for certain applications. So the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic became quite prosperous, and the vast majority of the Ukrainian people were in favor of the Soviet government. However, you had this faction led by Stefan Bandera, who allied with the Nazis during World War II, at least in the beginning, overtly allying with them, and they engaged in serious atrocities and massacres, primarily in Western Ukraine. So that's kind of the background of what happened in World War II. And after World War II, I've done some studies on this and other articles that I've written. The population of Ukraine I think in 1945 or 1948 was something like 35 million. And by 1991, it was 53 million. So there's been a significant increase in the population. My friend talks a lot about what was life actually like in the Soviet Union, and she grew up during I guess you could say during the 1970s, and she said that if you lived in the Soviet Union, you would get a free apartment. If you're a family, a husband and a wife with 3 kids, you immediately got a free apartment. It wasn't a big apartment, but it was an apartment, and it was your apartment. How many free apartments has the U.S. government given out to its citizens? Ask somebody on the street in L.A. What their free apartment is. It's like a broken down tent on the street with shit all over the place and drug addicts and all this kind of stuff. And none of that was happening in the Soviet Union. So anyway, she talks about that. And then what happened after when the Soviet Union fell, it became you could say oligarchic and criminal interests got control of the government in Ukraine and caused massive problems. Life was, and she says, life was extremely difficult. They were basically living on, flour. They baked their own bread from flour and some vegetables, and that was basically it. So life was very difficult during the 1990s. Then in 2004, there was what was called the Orange Revolution. And you had this guy named, I forget his first name, his last name is Yushchenko. And, but it turns out that his wife was, I think she's like an American citizen. She's a U.S. intelligence asset. And this guy was a puppet of the United States. And so they had this, it was called the Orange Revolution. And as my friend points out, so suddenly out of nowhere appear thousands of orange flags and banners and T-shirts and all these kinds of things. And she didn't think about it at the time, but she was talking with other Ukrainians who didn't support this, and they said, "Who do you think? This is an American project here. You don't want to deal with these. They're messing around inside your country." But she didn't understand that at the time. One of the most cynical things I'll just mention is the fact that there was you could have an orange T-shirt, because it's an Orange Revolution, with an image of Che Guevara. So here's Che Guevara, the ultimate anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist person, being used by the capitalist pigs to seduce the Ukrainian people to break away from their natural familial ally, Russia, and go with the West. And what happens after that? The country gets sold out, lock, stock, and barrel, to the point where it is right now. And and her words are, it's a four-letter word beginning with S and ending with T, and it's an Orwellian state. So that's basically giving you a sneak preview on what she said. So I'm just going to leave it at that, and you can listen to some of the things that she has to say. She has very favorable views of the Soviet Union, and she has very favorable views of Russia. And the reality is that in this war that's gone on, as she points out, after the Maidan revolution, again another color revolution by the United States, these virulently Russophobic elements outlawed anything and everything having to do with Russia, and including even the ability to speak Russian. So if you listen to a Russian language pop song, some people will come up and beat you up, or they'll you can be prosecuted, for using Russian in the wrong place. This is the nature of the current regime, But has anybody? How many of you have heard this? Probably you haven't heard any of that. And then you say, "Oh, Russia invaded unprovoked." Well, another interesting side note, which she told me in a phone call, was that after these audios, was that she moved to Canada because the conditions in Ukraine were so bad. And for a time, Canada was a great place to live. She was living in Montreal. But she pointed out that, Canada is a bilingual country also. You've got an English-speaking part of Canada, and you've got French-speaking Canada. And I said to her, what would it have been like, speaking as an analogy, if just as the United States used the Ukrainian language dominant part of Ukraine to stage a color revolution and then suppress the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, with the majority of the people actually speak Russian in Ukraine. What would have happened if Russia had gone into French Canada and fomented a revolution which took over the government and then was oppressing English-speaking Canadians? So this is, and she said, well, actually, there was some of that going on because some of these French separatists, and there have been referendums where they wanted to separate, and the referendums have failed. But many of these French were communists. So if you can imagine a French communist-dominated Canada right on the U.S. border, and in how many minutes would the United States be invading Canada to get rid of that unacceptable situation? And yet, when something like this happens on Russia's doorstep, it's an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. So this is the kind of absurdity, and we're really through the looking glass here. So anyway, I hope you'll listen to what she has to say. She speaks with a fairly thick Russian accent, and like one of the words she uses, coil, what we would say is coal. But I hope that the reason why I am including her audios, because she said, well, my pronunciation isn't that good, but what I wanted to do is I wanted to have an authentic Ukrainian person, an authentic person from the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, basically the eastern part of Ukraine. We could say Novorossiya, just speaking her truth. So I thought this would be very useful, because I doubt if any of you have ever had the opportunity to hear this. So that's what I want to say, and I'll just leave my remarks below, and I've also included several of her audios, so you can listen to those and see what she has to say. Okay, thanks a lot for listening, and again, if you want to support my channel, you can do so through a donation or through buying a t-shirt. So thanks again, and I'll see you next time.